I love it when people make you seem better than you actually are. So thank you, Poppy. Um, so hello, everyone. Um, I typically get nervous before I start speaking, so this is usually my first slide. So hi, everyone. Thank you. Well, let's try that one more time. Hi, everyone. All right. So I am here to talk about a topic that has been in the news and everywhere for the last maybe 5 or so years. But it's a larger topic than um, we have given any um, any kind of time to. So I am going to briefly just provide some facts, and you can take from any of my presentation whatever it is that you want. I'm not providing a solution in any way, shape, or form. I'm just stating the absolute facts that exist. So, as I mentioned, that we're here to talk about inclusion, right? It is the buzzword right now, and everyone wants to talk about inclusion. But really, we're here to talk about this: diversity, inclusion, and equity. And what does that look like? For me, this is what that means, right? And I'll leave this up for a little bit. Um, but again, as I mentioned, it's all buzzwords if we don't really address the core piece of it. And to really look at those three things and to really get into the meat and potatoes of it, we have to ask ourselves this question right here: who has the right to own space? And to really address this question, we truly have to understand our history. So, and when I say our history, I mean US history and all of that. So, in addressing this question, we start off with here. So, everyone is familiar with the New Deals. The New Deals were essentially a series of reforms and policies collectively that were put together by the Roosevelt administration after um, the Deep Depression, the Great Depression. And that was essentially, these reforms were so that the Great Depression essentially didn't happen again. But there are two key agencies that were created that has affected us even to this day. And that was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC for short, in 1933, and the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, in 1934. So first we'll talk about the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The significance of the Homeowners Loan Corporation really is this. Everyone well, almost everyone I think may know about this, but everyone has heard the term redlining. So redlining, well, let me back up. So HOLC was essentially created to, create a secondhand mortgage market. So the mortgage market as we have today did not exist prior to this organization. So it was essentially created so that homeowners did not lose their houses. Um, this is a HOLC map of Indianapolis. And neighborhoods were graded in specific color coordination. Green was desirable. Blue was, it's still okay. Yellow was, it's falling, and red was basically don't do it. And the main reason why red was listed as that was mainly because of African Americans, Mexicans, and native non-whites is the actual term that was used. And I'm going to back up a little bit and say, so the New Deals, one of the ways that Roosevelt was able to get the New Deals passed was by appeasing the Southern Democrats. And if you're not aware, the Democrats essentially made a swing in the last 50 plus years or something like that. But prior to that, Southern Democrats were Southern Democrats, as this sounds. And the Southern Democrats truly believed in segregation. So to appease them, he created the New Deals. And because of that, their policies were then embedded into everything that the New Deals represented. So as I mentioned, this is Indianapolis, and this is downtown Indy. And this would help you understand it a little bit better. So the red line areas were all neighborhoods that were native to African Americans, so on and so forth. Yeah. And if you notice on this map, the overall Indianapolis map, there are about 3 areas that are aligned in green. Specifically, Irvington is one of them within the core of downtown. And the reason for that, as it relates to Indianapolis, was because of this guy, D.C. Stevenson. If you're not familiar with him, he wasn't the nicest of people. He was a member of the KKK and actually separated from the KKK to create his own organization that was worse than the KKK, and basically rose to prominence in Indiana by way of the KKK, and also embedding himself in the politics of Indiana, going as far as actually selecting the governor and the mayor of Indianapolis in the 1920s. This is actually Indianapolis. This is not Birmingham. This is not, and sorry about the image, but this is actually Indianapolis. So we like to think of Indianapolis as separate, but all of this was happening. So now we go into the Federal Housing Administration, which was created in 1934. So the FHA was essentially created to standardize quality construction in the U.S. And at the same time to ensure loans for home building. But as I mentioned, that the ideals of the Southern Democrats were deeply embedded in specifically the housing agencies. And it was mainly towards veterans coming back from the war. And after veterans came back and the VA was created in 1935, I believe, they essentially took on they essentially modeled themselves after the FHA, which was already embedded with all of these segregationist policies, right? So then what came about from that was real estate practices that were, for lack of a better word, just racist as hell. Specifically, the FHA had an underwriting manual that specifically in 1933 called out for racially restricted covenants. If you're not familiar with what that is, you can read for yourself. And these covenants were in every single city in the U.S. And the images, I'll let the images speak for themselves. They were simply ways of separating people as best as you can by providing the minimal standard, but at the same time, separate but equal I believe was the term. And this is a direct quote from the actual manual. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. Indianapolis was not different, as I mentioned, that this was prominent in every single city. This is our general ordinance from 1926. An ordinance relating to the establishment by white persons of a home residence in Negro community and establishment by Negroes. Essentially, Indianapolis wasn't any different, as I mentioned. So let's go down to even deeper into our neighborhood. This is an actual scan of a neighborhood ordinance from Indianapolis, specifically Marie and Kessler in Indianapolis. And for the longest time, and I will say this, some of these are still on the boards. They're not enforced anymore, but they're still within the bylaws of these communities, right? Other racial practices that happen, there were many other racial practices, racist real estate practices that happened, specifically blockbusting, and as well as predatory lending. So if you're not familiar with blockbusting is essentially the practice of a real estate agent hiring a black person to walk through a neighborhood, specifically a black woman walking through a neighborhood with a stroller, to then panic white people to move out, which then those real estate developers would come in and buy their property, which then the next racist real estate practice would happen, which was predatory lending or reverse redlining, which is then I buy a house for $5,000, sell it to a black or brown family for $10,000, and if you can't pay me, I'm going to kick you out and then cycle that neighborhood again. This is an advert from a St. Louis newspaper. So within as all of this is happening, the FHA decided that, you know what, we are going to get people out of downtown, and we were going to increase the middle class, specifically the white middle class, and their ability to purchase homes. So then we have what we call white flight, which was essentially a flee to the to suburbia, right? And prior to that, suburbia didn't exist. This complex was one of the first in the city. I don't know if everyone here has heard about Levittown, but Levittown was 17,500 homes that were built, roughly in size of 750 square feet at a cost price of about $8,000. But even with all of that, right? And it was specifically geared towards veterans as well. And the main big part for anybody here who's a homeowner, no down payment. This is Levittown. Yeah. This is the beginning of the suburbs, essentially. But Levittown had racially restricted covenants that were enforced by the FHA. I mean, enforced even so that as a black contractor, you could work on these homes. And there are several stories like this. You can just Google it. You could work on these homes, but you could not buy into these homes. And if you did buy into the homes, you would be met with picketers as the photo on the left, right? So over time, people, some smart people, and black and brown folks started to really complain about everything and picketing and everything like that. So then the government's response to that was urban renewal, urban redevelopment, which was essentially, hey, we are going to come into the downtown and clean up the slums. So the slums that have already been created by limiting a certain class of people to an area and saying that, no, this is your area, either by racially restrictive covenants and other racial practices, or by physically doing so. For example, there was a development in Detroit where the FHA would not give a developer would not back the developer's loans. And the only way they were because it was in close proximity to an African American community, and the only way he was able to get his loan was to physically build a 12-inch thick wall between his community and the African American community to the west. So this is New Haven, Connecticut. What we now know of urban renewal and urban redevelopment as the creation of the highway system, right? So we decided to separate people in the cities, and then we convince another class of people to move out of the cities, but they still need the cities. So now we need to connect them back to the cities. So we need to create the highway system. And how do we do that? We bulldoze people's houses. And when we bulldoze people's houses, we then put them in. Oh, I love this slide. I found this, and I thought it was freaking awesome. And this is a letter from a community. And I will also say this. This was not just black and brown communities. This was poor whites as well. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that the areas that were redlined were non-native whites, blacks, and browns. So, but we then started to house people in towers. So this is Cabrini Green in Chicago. And when it was proposed to be a modernist community, towers in the sky, and you could live like a king, right? But we know of what it became, right? Pruitt-Igoe, it's another one. Concrete jungles in the sky. Chrysler Freeway in Detroit. And Indianapolis was not any different, again. So this is Indianapolis in 1958. This is Indianapolis in 2014. And I'm going to go back and forth, and you can see the difference between the two. So we went from a thriving downtown that was connected to empty parking lots and highway system being driven through communities. I mean, granted, we still use all of these pieces today, but we cannot, as I mentioned earlier, we cannot address the diversity and inclusion and equity without understanding our history. And now we move into modern times, where we now have this topic of gentrification, the big G word that everyone talks about, right? So gentrification is very, very sticky and icky, and there's a lot of pieces to it, and they're all moving. That's why it hasn't been solved. And I don't know if it has the ability to be solved. Because what we often think about gentrification is this definition that's listed up here. But the other piece that we also don't talk about is that gentrification itself happens in other areas. So gentrification is not only an urban city thing. Gentrification is technically happened by meaning, by definition, it's technically happening in Carmel by farmers being displaced from their homes and new houses coming up, right? So as I mentioned, I showed Cabrini Green earlier. The positive of that is Cabrini Green was torn down. But when it was torn down, again, it was people's homes and the people were living there. And what happened with Cabrini Green is this, which is essentially just redevelopment, urban redevelopment again. That everything that had happened before is happening again. So the people who lived in Cabrini Green are not able to live in these communities again. And now I'm going to talk about a study that was done in 2018, specifically by the Brookings Institute, called the Devaluation of African American Neighborhoods. And I'm going to put this up here while I tell a story. So I own my own home right now. But prior to that, it took me 2 years to get approved for a loan to buy a house. I'm not hurting for money. My credit score is pretty damn good, but it still took me 2 years to get a home. And my story is not a singular thing. It happens every day, right? But so you have all of these things that has happened, and still people have figured out a way to survive and get past all of this. And finally, they're able to own their own home. But then you have this piece that is still happening. So even after you own your home, Black neighborhoods are still devalued upwards of $156 billion. So this number, the average loss in home market value between a black neighborhood of the same caliber as a white neighborhood of the same caliber has been averaged out to about $48,000. And if you take that number, you multiply it by the number of Black home owners in the United States, you come up with a loss of $156 billion. And again, this is not native to um, it is not native to just one area, right? Indianapolis is the same. So the average median home value of a Black neighborhood is about $94,000. If you take away all of the absence of the devaluation, that number goes up to $112,000. That's a significant difference in that value there. But we all know that homeownership has its benefits, right? But you have a certain class of people who have never or who have been delayed in experiencing those benefits. And even when they've gotten up and gotten to a point where they have those benefits, you are still limiting their access. And I'm going to say this, and I'm going to leave this up so that you can look at it for a second. So this is a system that was designed, and as designers here, we always use the mantra "design can save the world," right? But we also forget that design is the reason why we're in this shit. Because we often think of design as it has to be designed from the beginning all the way to the end. But we forget that design is very much an iterative process of, well, this is our result from the first time. Let's look at how we can either expand that result or limit that result. And over time, I'm just going to say they have gotten really, really good at creating the system. So on the left is a Hulk security map, a red line map. In the middle is a segregation map that was created for talking about IPS schooling and education in Indianapolis. Which, by the way, little bit tidbit of a fact. Did you guys know that Indianapolis schools were not segregated until 1927? Prior to that, Black, brown, and Mexican kids all went to school at the same place. And on the far right is a 2010 census map. In urban planning, we look at patterns. And when we see a pattern, we try to get into it, right? So there's a pattern here talking about a design system. And to close out, And based on that pattern, I would say the question still goes of who has the right to own space. And I will end my presentation with this quote from Malcolm X, because I just love this quote. So what he says is, I don't think having an opportunity to ride either at the front or the back of or the middle of someone else's bus does not dignify you. When you have your own bus, then you have dignity. When you have your own school, you have dignity. When you have your own country, you have dignity. When you have something of your own, you have dignity. But whenever you are begging for a chance to participate in that which belongs to someone else, or use that which belongs to someone else on an equal basis with the owner, that's not really dignity. That's ignorance. So thank you very much. As I said, you can clap. Sorry.